Well, good morning and welcome. My name is Gay Wilson. I'm Senior Fellow at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, which is here at Monticello. And I want to greet you today and welcome you to on behalf of the Virginia Humanities, in that they are the producer of the Virginia Festival for the Book. And we're very happy to see you all here this morning for this session on the illimitable freedom of the human mind, and a conversation then with our author, Andrew O'Shaughnessy. So this, a little bit of business, of course, to get out of the way. So let me get back to my notes here. But please remember, if you haven't already, to silence your mobile phones. We always ask that. And in years past, if you've been to some of the sessions, you would have known that as you came through the door, you got a little paper sheet that said to please fill this out and for an evaluation to let us know. But this year, they're doing it a little different. They would like for you, whenever you can, to please go online. And I've tested it. It really works very efficiently and easy. But you go to VABook, VABOOK.org, and you do that /feedback. And immediately then the form will come up. They've kept it very short, very simple, but they really ask that you do this for them because it does help with the programming and knowing what to plan, how to plan. So please do an evaluation form for the Virginia Festival of the Book. And while you're on their site, there's another little place there that, if you like, you can donate, because the festival does work very hard to try to keep these sessions free, no charge to the public. You're welcome to come, but of course there are costs involved. So if you can possibly give a donation, they would appreciate that as well. So we really would like for you to do those things for us. And immediately after, there will be book sales and book signing. If you already have your book, take it. We're going straight across the courtyard here to the museum shop. Andrew will be set up there with books you can either purchase, or, like I say, if you have your book, he's more than happy to inscribe it to you, sign it for you. So please go over immediately after the talk. So we'll try to stay pretty prompt on this. The other thing I wanted to thank you for is working with us on our COVID precautions that we're taking. Things finally looking a little better in Albemarle County. We can be happy of that. But thank you for wearing your mask, because Monticello is still requesting that inside the buildings that you do remain masked. Now, Christian, well, I don't have a mask on, but please trust me, Andrew and I were tested as soon as we got here this morning, because it was agreed that as long as we're up here at the podium, we could speak to you without the mask. It does help on the sound and whatever, but we will be masking once we're back out in your midst. But thank you very much for working with us on this. Of course, it's very difficult, but so there's the formalities out of the way. So I'll give you a little background on our author today. Many of you may know him because Andrew is a vice president here at Monticello, and he is the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. He also holds a professorship at the University of Virginia in the History Department. And in addition, he is a member of he's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in London. A little closer to home, he is on the editorial board for the Jeffersonian America series, which is published here in Charlottesville by the University of Virginia. And he did his BA, MA, and PhD at Oriel College at Oxford. Now, prior to this current book, Andrew had a very successful book called The Men Who Lost America: British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of Empire. That was published in 2013. It won 8 national book awards. And among these were the New York Historical Society American History Book Prize. He won the George Washington Book Prize and the Military History Book Prize. And even before that book, another that was a very successful book, An Empire Divided: The American Revolution and the British Caribbean. That came out in 2000, and it was an alternate selection for the History Book Club. So prior to this work, Andrew has given us some very interesting approaches, some very interesting insights, slightly different, on our American Revolution, from kind of the British side to the Caribbean. But with Illimitable Freedom, he's moved a little closer to home here, also moved a little further into the early American Republic, moving a little later in Jefferson's life, because as you may know, it was a Jefferson retired here to Monticello who began thinking on, well, he'd been actually thinking, Andrew's going to tell you all this, thinking on it for a long time, but education, how to come about a university here in Virginia, and of course, he preferred Charlottesville. So I think we're very fortunate that Andrew has done this research for us, and I think it's going to give you some interesting insights then on Jefferson and his ideas on education and how then the University of Virginia came about. So please join me in welcoming Andrew O'Shaughnessy.
Thank you, and thank you to Gay Wilson for introducing me, my former colleague, and to you for joining us this morning and braving the pandemic. The biggest revelation for me writing this book is that I cannot think of any head of state of any country who spent so long conceiving and creating a university. So that in itself is very remarkable, and especially the fact that he did it between the ages of 73 and 83 and was involved in every detail. The architecture. Jefferson, although he had help from William Thornton and Benjamin Latrobe, designed the buildings and the whole concept of a village of buildings, a community, which we'll come back to. He surveyed the land of the university as the son of a surveyor. He designed the courses as an intellectual. This is his list of books for Anglo-Saxon. I always like to point this out because we think of him as a STEM person, interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In actual fact, he thought that Anglo-Saxon was essential for people to study. It also came across that he was very politically skilled. These are his minutes as secretary. Obviously, he had help from other people, but he was even very skilled in how he got that help. Joseph Cabell is probably, or Cabell, is probably the best remembered ally of Jefferson, after whom Cabell Hall is named. And Jefferson used Cabell much as he used James Madison in the 1790s as the front man in the Senate, in Cabell's case, at the Virginia State Assembly, to really push through the bills. Jefferson, incidentally, as a trained lawyer, even wrote the bills for the university. He even wrote the conveyance of the land for the university. And he invited every student up here to Monticello to visit. What you're looking at is the Declaration of Independence, both the original version that he wrote and the printed version next to it. The students would come in groups of 3 to 7 every Sunday evening, and he would show them this document, and he would tell them stories of George Washington and of Benjamin Franklin. Those were his favorite founders. And this must have been magnificent to a student in 1825, when nearly all the revolutionaries were dead. There was no one from the South who'd signed the Declaration of Independence who was still alive. And we've got some marvelous accounts of those dinners, one of which by Henry Tirrett, which he gave at an alumni meeting 50 years later. And he described how Jefferson would push back his chair. And Jefferson was going deaf, and he didn't want to stop the students from talking among each other. And he just wanted to watch them in conversation, because this is what he'd always imagined a real scholarly life should be. Tirrett also described how Martha Jefferson, his daughter, would preside at these dinners, and she'd gently tease her father during the course of the dinner. So, for example, she said, "I keep trying to get him to read novels, and he hates novels. So I brought him Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and gave it him, and he disliked it." Having failed to get or provoke Jefferson at this point, she then provoked him a little more and said, "One of my favorite books is Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries on the English Law." Now, I'm not even sure that lawyers curl up with books of commentaries on the law, but the point about Sir William Blackstone is he'd been a Chief Justice under George III, and Jefferson despised him in the text, and he was worried that if American law students read this book, it would turn them into Tories and monarchists, and he really didn't want it at his university. So you can see how mischievous she was being during these dinners, but also the kind of conversation that he so much wanted to promote. Jefferson, of course, regarded the university as one of his three greatest achievements in life. This is what he wanted as the epitaph on his tombstone, to be remembered as author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and finally as father of the University of Virginia. But it's always been treated very much as an epilogue to his career. Biographers treat it briefly in a final chapter. Very few have considered his life in relation to the university. There are, of course, histories of the university, but they're focused more on the institution. The idea of this book is, in order to understand the institution, you have to understand Jefferson. Furthermore, this was just the apex of a much broader educational vision. He was wanting to have a three-tier education system, beginning with primary schools, in which there would be public education for boys and girls. Like all of Jefferson's ideas, and like the Declaration of Independence, it was flawed. It was supposed to have scholarships. The scholarships never appeared for 20 years. It was supposed to be a public university. It was the most expensive university other than Harvard. And it was supposed to have freedom of ideas, but he wanted it to be a Republican university. And of course, it had slavery, 200 enslaved people at any one time. But nevertheless, like the Declaration of Independence, it was revolutionary. And we're going to spend most of this time seeing what was revolutionary about his ideas. But before I do that, I do want to stress how helpful it was to write this here at Monticello. We edit the papers of Thomas Jefferson, and I've got the editor here, Jeff Looney, in the audience. You might take a stand, Jeff. Jeff edits the papers for the retirement series, which is the period when the university was founded. This gave me a lot of original material. One of my favorites is the Rockfish Gap Commission. This was the blueprint for the university in 1818. The amazing thing about this commission was there's 22 people who met at Rockfish Gap near Stanton. An incredibly beautiful vista, which you can see when you drive up there. There's a blue plaque. The point about it, though, was before those 22 people had met, Jefferson had already written the commission report. He'd not only just written the commission report, he'd written 3 different drafts. And I know that thanks to the work of Jeff Looney and his team. And we can see in each draft how he tried to make it appeal to these commissioners from all over Virginia, including the western half of Virginia, where there was the most opposition, and also the east and the northern neck. I'd always wondered why we didn't have a full description of the laying of the foundation stone of the university. There were 3 presidents present: James Madison, Jefferson, and James Monroe. It was a celebrity event. Monroe was actually president when it occurred. And so I wondered, why don't we have a lengthy description? Why is there just a paragraph in each book? Well, thanks again to the Jefferson papers, we have the Freemasons' account of exactly what occurred, detailed accounts of how they sang Hail Columbia, which was like the national anthem of the period, how they sang Jefferson's marching song and Madison's marching song, and how the judges came down from Court Square with a huge procession to assemble on the field, which is now the lawn, and a lengthy description. Also, we have the Getting Word project here about the descendants of the enslaved community of Monticello. And that's been very useful because many of the people featured are also at the university. So let me focus then on what are the central ideas and what distinguished Jefferson's idea of a university from other universities in America. And it should be said that Jefferson was never entirely original in his ideas. He was original in the way he synthesized ideas and borrowed from others. One of the key concepts was the idea of an academical community. This was to have professors living among students and not just have one big central building. To have different dining halls. At Harvard, they had a refectory, a dining hall, which was the largest kitchen in Massachusetts and was the site of frequent bread fights and other events. Prescott, the famous historian of South America, was blinded in one of these events. It was a gradual process, but it began with bread being thrown at him. Jefferson wanted the professors to dine with the students and for the students to be in small groups, a little bit like fraternities, so that they were part of a larger community, but also in a small community, enabling them to integrate. And what he was really trying to do was reproduce his own experience from William and Mary and his time in Williamsburg. And these 3 men were especially important. George Wiv, his law teacher, to whom he essentially was interned, William Small from Scotland, his first real professor, the only lay professor at William and Mary, and Governor Francis Fakir at the governor's mansion, who would host these dinner parties where there'd be music and conversation. And Jefferson really wanted to reproduce these, and that's what he was doing with the students on a Sunday evening, what his granddaughter called Feasts of Reason. Of course, the pavilions were really quite grand for professors. The whole idea of professors and academic profession was still relatively novel. The teaching rooms would be on the bottom floor, and they were clearly designed for bachelors. So almost from the start, they proved really difficult because nearly all the professors got married soon after their arrival. But the most striking feature of the university, what really distinguished it, and what caused the most opposition, was that it was a secular university. And in this, it has more in common with modern universities. Jefferson proposed the idea of the university in 1800, and no one has really ever emphasized the importance of that date. He proposed it to this man, Joseph Priestley, the founder of Unitarianism, and also one of the great scientists of his age. And the reason that this is so important is he was in the middle of an election campaign, and one of the most bitter election campaigns of any period. And Jefferson was particularly upset about being accused of being an atheist by his opponents. And the bitterest critics were the heads of colleges in the North. Perhaps the most extreme was Timothy Dwight, the head of Yale University. And Timothy Dwight asked his students to pledge not to vote for Jefferson. He said, if you vote for Jefferson, we'll be forced to become atheists. You'll have to sing the Ça ira, the anthem of the French Revolution, and mothers will be thrown out and families destroyed if this man is elected. Jefferson was immensely bitter because the whole higher education system was dominated by his opponents, the Federalists, and it was dominated by Presbyterians, whose main base of strength was in New England. So although more recently people have argued he wanted a university in the South to protect and expand slavery, this was not the case. To begin with, Jefferson always claimed to be anti-slavery, calling it a deplorable entanglement. But more importantly, Northern universities were not especially anti-slavery. Anti-slavery really emerges first with the Quakers and with an evangelical movement from religious movement, not from universities. In fact, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton were very accommodating to Southern students. What Jefferson detested was the Federalists controlled even the majority of the universities in the South, including places like Hampden, Sydney, and Washington College. The year that the bill went through for the founding of the University of Virginia was the same year that 1819, the same year that he was working on this book. He called it The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. A lot of people today call it the Jefferson Bible. Essentially, he took some 5 different copies of the Gospels and cut and paste. And he removed all of the miracle stories. He removed the Trinity, anything that was metaphysical or theological, and essentially produced a moral code, what he thought were the original sayings of Jesus, with the removal of what he called the accretions of age. And it was a kind of textual critique. It was a remarkable work. He didn't expect anyone, though, to be reading it. It was purely for his own beliefs, purely for his own interest. But of course, he insisted that religion was a private matter. And this he thought essential with the university. The result of the university being secular meant that it was the first university in America to have a Jewish professor, Joseph Sylvester. And Sylvester was a brilliant mathematician. He brought the Hebraic terms into the mathematical language, and he invented the word graph. And he was later at Johns Hopkins and ended his career at Oxford University. It had one of the first Catholic professors. We tend not to think of Catholics today as discriminated against, but of course they were in 19th century America. And there was profound opposition to this. So a visiting lay preacher came to Charlottesville, and he was shouted at by local youths in Court Square. And he said, and Roger Buckley has this in his book about men at Yale, he said, the devil looked at the map of the world and he put his thumb down on Charlottesville and said to God, you can have the rest, this will be mine. And it was because it was secular that it did not get the expected number of students in the early years. People were concerned about the effects on the morals of their children. Remember, most universities at the time, you had to go to chapel not just on a Sunday, but twice a day. And they were tolerant to a degree. If you were a fellow Protestant, they were open to different Protestant denominations, but not to Catholics, and certainly not to Jews and non-Christian groups. And there was even discrimination within the Protestant groups as well. Another defining feature of Jefferson's University was the sheer breadth of subjects that were offered, the comprehensive approach. In fact, that's why he called it a university, a very smart word. The words academy, college, seminary, university were often used almost interchangeably, but some 30 colleges in America use the term university. Harvard didn't use it until the 1770s. Columbia didn't use it till the late 19th century, and Princeton was the same. But the idea of a university was that it taught graduate studies and that it would be comprehensive. There would be sciences. That was quite novel. This was one of the first universities to teach chemistry. It was almost the first university to teach economics. And it offered the traditional classics, but a lot of new courses. Modern languages were not widely taught at universities in this period. They were at the University of Virginia. And what is remarkable is only 3 years after Jefferson's death, Yale put out a report saying that what we should really be focusing on is the classics. So Jefferson's model was really a contrast to what was at the time the most influential university of the day, Yale. Yale produced more of the presidents of universities than any other university, and it was the most national along with Princeton in terms of its outreach and popularity. What was also significant was differences of pedagogy. This is, of course, one of the first students, Edgar Allan Poe, in that first year class. And Jefferson wanted to break with the traditional system of teaching by recitation. I've only once been taught in my life by a teacher literally reading out from a book. It's not an exciting way to learn. Jefferson was a believer in the lecture system of teaching, and also introduced some of the first exams in America. But the most important and distinctive feature was the elective curriculum, where students could choose what courses they wanted to study. Everywhere else you had a system of courses and you had to follow a particular curriculum. It wasn't always in one subject. Harvard had a sort of 5-year or 4-year plan where you could study a number of subjects, but you had to do them in a specific order, and you had to do all the subjects that were prescribed. With Jefferson, he wanted people essentially to choose between three different specialist areas, but they could choose the courses in any order that they wanted. And this really reflects his political views of giving people the right to choose, and also his belief in the freedom of the mind and freedom of choice. Now, William and Mary and the University of North Carolina had experimented with this, but it was Jefferson who made it popular. And the significance of that is that today, this is the hallmark of American education. People choosing the courses that they want to study. To some extent, we restrict them a bit more today by insisting people be in classes and take basic subjects to begin with. But the idea is still there, the major, the minor, and choosing a lot of other courses to go along with it. Another feature that's unusual to Jefferson is his belief in student governance and the idea that the students would play a role in overseeing themselves. And this is a period where in some places they were still beating students, where students were often treated like school children. You could go to Harvard as young as the age of 12. Jefferson made Virginia, the cutoff age was 16, and he was very proud that only about 25% of the students were below 18. That was rather remarkable for this period. What was also distinctive was that students had their own room or simply had one other person in their room. There were no dorms. At Hampden-Sydney, they had about 50 students to a dorm. This was very rare. It was partly for health reasons, and that was also part of what informed his academical village. But it also, we think he possibly was modeled on a monk's cell. It was for intellectual reasons as well. When he'd been at William and Mary, he was particularly critical of how the children attending the little school at William and Mary would make so much noise and distract the students from their studies. And so this also allowed students to focus a lot more as well. Another feature that was distinctive was that he emphasized the excellence of the faculty. He wanted the faculty to be outstanding. He wanted star professors. And when he couldn't persuade some of Harvard's best faculty to leave and come to Charlottesville, he turned instead to Europe and specifically Britain to recruit his professors. Five of the first 8 professors were brought over from Britain. One of them was German, the only non-English speaking professor, although he was fluent in English, but not as a first language. This is Robley Dunlinson, who was the first professor of medicine, and also, incidentally, Jefferson's personal physician, who was with him at the time of his death. Dunlinson is now known as the father of American physiology, really a very important figure in medicine. This is George Tucker, and we have one of his descendants, so I won't embarrass in the audience, but Jefferson believed in faculty governance as well. They were overseen by the Board of Visitors, but there was no president, no administration. The professors were in charge of really running the university, and this was the first faculty chair, and they rotated much like the governorship of Virginia, just doing a year at a time, which was later changed. And of course, in 1900, the university acquired its first president in Alderman. But Tucker, again, an outstanding figure. He'd been a congressman for many years. He was one of the first professors of economics in America. he wrote the first major biography of Thomas Jefferson. He had views that could only be described as Hamiltonian. They were very at odds with a lot of Jefferson's views on economics and on the role of the central state. And he wrote the first science fiction novel in America, as well as doing a novel about the Shenandoah Valley. And in order to write that novel, he went and lived in the Shenandoah Valley to be able to describe the accents and the lifestyle. The other thing that comes across, and that is unusual, is the sheer creativity of his ideas for the university. This is one of my favorites. The most important building would be the library. And incidentally, this became the second largest library in America after Harvard, which had been founded 200 years earlier. Jefferson wrote out the entire 6,000 and more books that were going to go in the library. But at the top of the library, in what is now the rotunda, he wanted to have a planetarium. And there would be a boomstick with a professor sitting on a saddle, guided by a student going through the planets. And it's sort of ultimate show and tell for a lecturer, but it's typical of his creativity. Downstairs in the rotunda and the passageways below, he wanted that to be used for athletics. He had a comprehensive vision of a university that actually was broader than many modern universities. He wanted to have art galleries and sculptors and museums as part of the university. Elizabeth Chu, who's now at Montpellier, thinks that he wanted his collection from the hallway at Monticello to be transferred over to, I knew it was certainly a lot of the objects were left in his will, to be transferred over to the university. And she thinks it was a museum that was burnt in the fire. Finally, I just want to emphasize that the university had a real impact on higher education in America. And this is something that has not really been looked at in a sustained way. And it's always difficult to demonstrate influence because people are influenced by a lot of models and a variety of ideas, just like Jefferson himself. But we do have some very specific examples. The most surprising is Harvard. 5 of Harvard's most prominent presidents looked in detail at Jefferson's ideas. The first was Josiah Quincy, who actually started to come down to Charlottesville soon after Jefferson's death, just after he'd been inaugurated at Harvard, and he got as far as Washington. And he had to turn back because of a pandemic. And there was a typhoid pandemic, and the university was in lockdown. Charles William Walker Elliott was another who really tried to introduce the elective curriculum at the university. Jones Conant in the 1960s did a book on Jefferson and education, which he hoped to inform public education and not just education at the college level. William Barton Rogers, who was the founding president of MIT, was a faculty member at UVA. His widow said that everything at MIT had been conceived in the halls of UVA. The University of Michigan, the head of that, also corresponded with Jefferson. The University of Texas in Austin was founded by a group from Charlottesville conveying Jefferson's ideas. When Jefferson was creating the university, he was in regular contact with 2 Harvard professors, both the first Americans to start studying in Germany, which at the time was really at the cutting edge of academia. One was George Tickner, who introduced the elective curriculum at a limited level within the languages schools. The other was Edward Everett, who became president of Harvard and who wrote a report on the university anonymously in a major periodical that really popularized knowledge of the university throughout America. And Herbert Baxter Adams at Johns Hopkins, a leading authority on education, really helped to make the University of Virginia and its ideas very famous in the 1870s and 1880s. And Adams said there's not a school in the South that has not been influenced by the University of Virginia. But the university that I show here is not even in the United States, it's in Britain. Jefferson was always very good at propagating his ideas and really helping to advertise and market the university. So he deliberately had copies of the Rockfish Gap Commission printed, and he sent them out to England. And this is University College London. It was the first university in England founded outside of Oxford and Cambridge. And it was entirely secular, like the University of Virginia. And two of its first professors were University of Virginia alumni. When I say alumni, they were the first faculty at the university, George Long and Thomas Key. And Jefferson had sent the founder of this university, Lord Brougham, a copy of the report while this idea was still, as it were, in mothballs, and he helped to energize the creation of the university. So he described this as his hobby of old age. I rather like this quote a few months before he died. I'm closing the last scenes of life by fostering and fashioning an establishment for the instruction of those who come after us. I hope its influence on their virtue, freedom, fame, and happiness will be salutary and permanent. What I really want to leave you with and to emphasize is that Jefferson understood that we would one day look back at him and his generation as backward. He understood, he even used the term, he said, they will regard us in the same way as we regard our witch-burning ancestors. But the point of the university was that it would create a framework for progress and for improvement of society that he hoped would be based on evidence and rational thinking. And one of his favorite lines was to say that he hoped the current living generation would not be held back by what he called the dead hand of the past. That they wouldn't feel that they couldn't make changes, that they wouldn't over-venerate their ancestors, ironically, that they would realize that they too could achieve just as much as their predecessors, and that it was now their responsibility to make changes for the better. And he didn't prescribe what those changes would be, because obviously his whole idea was that the older generation not formulate what the next generation would do. But the fact is, if you look at the students, even from that first class, Henry Tirrett, who told the stories of Martha Jefferson at the dinner table, he went on to found one of the first co-ed schools in Alabama and to be president of the University of Alabama, and his daughter became one of the first female heads of a college. In other words, it inaugurated the kinds of improvements that Jefferson himself may not have envisaged, but he understood that the next generations might go in different directions, and that these, he hoped, would be based on evidence and rational thinking that would lead to improvement. Thank you very much. And we can take questions from the floor. I'm also going to watch Whitney, who's got some questions from the audience that is watching on YouTube and online. Yes.
And you mentioned the first Catholic professor. Who was that?
He was Hungarian, and I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try. But there was an outcry about the appointment of these professors, and what I find interesting is that the people who opposed it locally said that there were over 50 applicants for each of these positions. And that's the sort of thing we don't really know, how many people would want to fill these positions. And the academic profession was still very young. None of these people who came to the University of Virginia had taught before. Or if they had, there was very limited experience. Most were just in their early 20s. And they're also terribly nervous because of the expectation by Jefferson of the breadth of subjects they were to teach. And George Long, for example, said, I'm meant to be teaching Hebrew. I've never studied Hebrew. And one of the criticisms Edward Everett made of the university is that he felt there were too few professors expected to teach too much. And also that he felt that the subjects were over-concentrated. It's impossible to learn Latin and Greek in the short time that Jefferson had in mind. I suppose one problem, which was pointed out by John Hartwell Cock, one of the members of the Board of Visitors, was that Jefferson thought all the students would be like himself and equally industrious and equally bright. Yes.
I understand that Mary Washington College was the women's college of UVA.
Yes.
Did Jefferson have a vision for a women's college?
He did not. And that's one of the disappointing features of his vision, because he was very enlightened in the education of his own daughters. And he said the chances of one of them marrying a blockhead were very high, and therefore he wanted them to have a sort of default. And sadly, Martha did have to go back to her education and teach school along with her daughters, because he left her so destitute. But he did not articulate a vision for women's education. It can be said that that they were only just beginning to found women's academies at the time of Jefferson's death. There weren't actually colleges admitting women in America. And if you look at Europe, a country like Germany, it's amazing how late women were able to go to university, late in the 19th century. Joseph Sylvester, the first Jewish professor in America who taught at the University of Virginia, he helped graduate the first woman PhD at Johns Hopkins. So I do feel there was a sort of flame lit here that helped to inspire improvement elsewhere. One of the surprising things to me, though, was that it seems that women were able to attend some of the classes. They were local and the lectures were public. There were women in the audience, at least of some of the science classes, because we have a description of that. He did believe strongly in the public benefit of universities. And so he even wanted the medical school to provide a free clinic, which is remarkable, and which it did a couple of afternoons each week to local people. The other question, of course, is what about African Americans? And clearly enslaved people were never part of his vision for education. But a Quaker with the surname Pleasance wrote to him in 1794 and put forward a plan for an African American school. And there was an African American school in Williamsburg when Jefferson was a student, and it was there throughout the 1760s, and colonial Williamsburg is currently now reviving it and making it a site. And Jefferson replied to Pleasance saying that there's no need. Why don't you just revive my bill for the general diffusion of knowledge, which would have provided free education for 3 years to both girls and boys who are free. He said that nowhere in that bill did I exclude African Americans. and it would be better to have integrated schools than separate ones, which is sort of goes against his own quoted racial views, and is rather remarkable. And indeed, if you look at any of his bills for education, a lot of people accuse him now of having sacrificed public education for the elitist project of a university. But as late as 1821, he brought another bill forward. And it's clear that one of the reasons these bills kept failing is he didn't even want clergymen teaching in the schools. And the clergy were really, I mean, one has to acknowledge that religion played a huge role in the very creation and origins of a university and in the spread of education. Massachusetts and Connecticut had the best education systems in the world. They weren't a complete public education system, but some of the highest literacy rates, along with Scotland, thanks to the insistence of Congregationalists and Presbyterians that people should be able to read the Bible. But Jefferson was such a purist about the state-church separation that he did not want clergy teaching at the lower school level or really in the university. Yes.
I'm very proud of being an alum.
Yes.
2 degrees from UVA, and a big part of that has been very proud of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And yet I have found that with the anti-racist movement, and really before that took off, that the hard look that people have taken of Jefferson's relationship with enslaved people, with Black people, I've found that both compelling and humbling. And I wonder how that has affected your work.
Well, this was a hugely important corrective. President Sullivan commissioned a report on slavery at the university after criticism, essentially, of how the university disregarded this history, as indeed had most universities in the South and elsewhere in the world that have been benefited from slavery. It's only been recently that most of them have confronted that. Professors at the university produced a book, one's called Educated in Tyranny. And these were an important corrective because this had been all but ignored in the history of the university. And I have combined this material in my book and say a lot more about it than I did in this lecture. On the other hand, you do not want to let correctives become the whole story. And what I think has been ignored, even in earlier histories, is this remarkable vision of a university that in many ways is a classic vision of a university, and that is still important today in terms of the way it can stimulate our thinking and reminding us what a university should be at a time when business models are taking over and we're talking about consumers rather than students. And we're talking about having a STEM curriculum rather than a broad curriculum. It's still worth the dialogue with this earlier vision. And we've got someone online who's asked a question, and then I think one at the back. Yes.
Yes, this is actually going to be our last question. This is from Chester online. Was the honor code unique to UVA?
Yes. Jefferson did not create the honor code, but in many ways his idea of student governance, the honor code really captured the ethos of what he wanted to create. His idea of student governance quickly collapsed after a riot that occurred while he was still alive that brought him to tears, not least because his own great nephew was the leader of it, and brought him to tears in front of the entire faculty, students, and board of visitors, including Madison, who tried to get up and give a speech and similarly could hardly speak and had to leave it to one of the other members of the Board of Visitors. It wasn't introduced until the 1830s, but it actually helped to curb the problem of student indiscipline. There were major riots, and a professor, of course, was famously killed, a law professor Davis, at the university. But it's often not pointed out that the last decade or so before the Civil War, there were no riots. And there are a number of reasons for that. One was the rise of the temperance movement. Another is that although there was no chapel at the university, the students were increasingly evangelical, and there was a huge evangelical movement in the South. And another, I think, is the honor code. Some people have suggested that the discipline was much worse because these were entitled young planters and because of slavery. The only thing I'd say to that is that if you look at Harvard, the yard was much more wild than the lawn. I mean, sometimes at least half a class would be dismissed from Harvard. John Quincy Adams' own son was dismissed from Harvard, and he himself couldn't get him reinstituted. The riots there were much worse. And incidentally, abolitionist speakers were often shouted down there too. And we had one at the back who I think, oh no, patiently, oh yes, here. Just next to you, right, yes.
You may have addressed this with a prior question, but I'm curious what you think Jefferson's opinion would be currently of modern day UVA and how his ideals and vision have transferred to what we see today at UVA here in Charlottesville.
Well, I was in Manassas a couple of days ago, and someone brought up the article in the New York Times by a young woman who was saying she didn't feel that free speech was safe at the university, and that she felt uncomfortable. And there's someone in the audience then said, we were saying that in the 1970s at the height of Vietnam. And you know, the fact is that even the places that are meant to protect freedom of speech, as de Tocqueville reminded us, when you're going against the majority of opinion, it's always going to be uncomfortable and you're going to need a lot of courage. I do think the university tries to address those kinds of issues. One of the things I like and love about the university is that it does focus a lot on undergraduate teaching. And most of the top schools are really graduate schools. And often undergraduates really get terribly neglected. And I'll mention no names, but I will tell you that a famous early American history professor teaching at one of the top schools said to me, I'd never send my own children here, not as undergraduates. These are graduate colleges. And there's a sort of joie de vivre among the students and the alumni of the university that I appreciate. As you heard earlier, I went to Oxford, and I always say that they're almost like sister universities. They're both the home of the Cavaliers, because the actual headquarters of the Cavaliers during the English Civil War was in Oxford. And sometime I'll tell you the origins of the term Cavalier here in Virginia, because they long predate the Cavalier song, which was when the university started adopting the term. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Andrew, and again, thank all of you for being here with us today. We really went to our max on the number of people we could have. We're excited about that. And so now we're going to let Andrew slip away here and go straight across, as I mentioned earlier, to the bookshop, which is right across in the museum shop, just straight across the courtyard. So please look for him there if you would like a book signed or if you need to buy a book. But thanks again for coming. We've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Andrew.
Sorry.
See ya.